Hello, this is the dialogue video that comes right after the tile maps and camera video. So we're at this point where you can run around in a scene and the camera follows you. That's it. So in this video, we're going to talk about making dialogue, making UI, look at scriptable objects, and just a little bit of scripting in general. So the first step is to make the UI what the dialogue is going to look like. So the very first thing we want to do is make a canvas, because any UI object has to go in a canvas. So same way we make any object, I'm going to go to the hierarchy, hit the plus button, UI, canvas. I'm going to name this canvas UI. In the settings, you got to do this at the beginning or else it will mess you up later, is change the canvas scale. In the canvas scaler component, change the constant pixel size to scale with screen size. So the UI is going to be the same size no matter what the resolution is. Let's change the reference resolution to 1920 by 1080. Another one would be like 1280 by 720. This one's just a little bit bigger, and that's it. We're good. Let's right click on the UI, create a child object. So let's go to UI and then image and name it dialog box. And for some reason when I was making this, I'm using the weird spelling of dialogue with the U and the E. So I'm pretty sure that's actually going to matter because we're going to reference it in scripting. So name it dialog box like that. And let's press F with it selected so that we can see it. Look like this. Maybe zoom out a little bit so you can see the entire canvas. And as a child of the dialog box, right click it again. UI, image, portrait. Name it portrait. And then one more time, right click on the dialog box, UI, image, and let's call it name box. So the portrait is going to be, it's going to show the avatar of the NPC who's talking. The name box is going to show the name. Let's click the dialog box and set the anchor point. So if I select dialog box, go to the inspector and the rect transform in this little crosshair looking box in the top left, click it, press shift and set it to stretch. And I think when you do that, you can see you can see the parameters in the rect transform change when we set it to stretch. Because instead of it just being the position of X and Y values, it's like how far from the left side of the screen is it, and so forth. Anyways, let's size it up a little bit so that it looks like a proper dialog box. I'm going to make it, drag it out to the left a little bit more, drag it out to the right a little bit more. Stretch the bottom and then stretch the top. One thing you don't want to do is change the scale from here. You see scale and there's like, everything is on 1. Theoretically, you can make it look good using that, but you don't want to do that. Just use the top and bottom ones because this is going to stretch out the object, and all of its children is going to be stretched out too. All of the children are going to be stretched out. So the name and the text is just going to look super stretched. So keep your scale values at 1 pretty much for every UI thing that you're going to do. Just keep those at 1. That looks decent. Change the color maybe. Ooh. Get something medieval. All right, and then the portrait. If you want, you could just press W and then drag it over. That's fine. Make the width 250, maybe 400 by 400. Width 400, height 400. Mine will be pretty big. That's fine. The name box. Drag it out like that. Sweet. Change the color. So that's a pretty good start. Let's add the text really quick. So for the name box, a child, right click, UI, Text Mesh Pro. It's going to ask you to import the TMP essentials. You can import the extras too. Should take a couple of seconds. Drag out the width of the text. Maybe drag up the height a little bit. I'm going to set the alignment to the middle here. And it doesn't need to be perfect right now, but I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger. And then right click on the dialog box and we're going to do the same thing. So UI, Text Mesh Pro, name it dialogue text. You can name the other one like name text. Dialogue text. Not gonna make it perfect right now, but just drag it out like that. Sweet. Change the font to Roboto. Do we have that? Looking good. That's what it's gonna look like so far. All right. If you want, because I usually don't have time to talk about this in class, but if you want to make it, if say you have your own UI, you're a UI artist, or you just want to use something you found on the internet, in the class assets we have, you just go to class assets UI. You have a bunch of different options. So something that I think might be worth showing is I'm just gonna choose 2 random boxes here. Guess I'll use this for the nameplate and that for the dialogue. Let me use this one for the dialogue. Back to Unity. I'm gonna, in my assets, right click, create folder, create a UI folder. Drag that stuff in there that I just downloaded. Where is it? Here and here. Keep it set to Sprite 2D and UI. Let's just show what it looks like if I were just to use it like that. So the dialog box, in the source image, I'll drag in this rectangle box. Looks pretty terrible. I'm going to set the color back to white too. For the dialog text, or the name box rather, I'll drag in that sprite. Set the color back to white. That too looks pretty terrible. So you can either use images that are properly sized for your dialog box, or alternatively, you can slice up the borders yourself so that the corners aren't so stretched. And how you do that is you would click on the source file, so the file that we just dragged into the project browser. Go to the sprite editor. I drag the left. You see this green line is moving as I drag the left. I'm just going to set it right so it's on top of that corner. I see that it's 8. Maybe I'll just set, probably good just setting them all to 8. And then you see each corner of the image is in this little green box. Hit apply. Cancel out of there. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the name box. Looks like that's going to be 7. I'm just going to set the right to 7, and then top going to be 8. Or actually, we'll do 6 and 6 for the top and apply. And then I think that's good for that. Now let's go click the dialog box again and set in the image component, set the image type from simple to sliced. That doesn't look very good still. Let's try on the name box. So if I select the name box, simple to sliced, that made the corners a lot smaller, but basically it's making the corners all the same size. So you can edit it with the pixels per unit multiplier. So say if I wanted it to be a little bit rounded, then I would just shrink that number to like 0.3 and maybe have to lower the width of my text to fit in there. For the dialog box, I'm just going to use the name box, title box instead. Then lower this to like 0.3. That looks pretty good. Right, way better than it looked before. Another handy thing to do right now to test the portrait, I just added to our class assets some of my avatars. If you just download one of them and drag them into your UI folder, downloads. You could also just use like your player sprite. So if I go to the portrait item and then in the source image slot, drag in a source image, you could see what that would look like. Let me try that with the avatar. Nice. And then if you want it to be bigger, you can just make it like 600 by 600. That looks pretty good. One more thing that we're going to add to the UI that we're not going to use yet, but we are going to reference it in script, so we don't want to get any errors trying to look for something that is not here. Let's go to the UI. We can collapse the dialog box. We're done with that. Let's right click on the UI and create another UI image and name it screen fade, which is what we're going to use for like switching between cutscenes or scene changes and stuff like that. For this one, let's go to the rect transform, click on the crosshair anchor button, shifts, and set it to stretch again. Now that we've done that, we can zero out the left, top, right, and bottom, so it takes up the entire screen, and then set the color to black. And then we're going to deactivate this object. So at the top, this check mark next to the title, just check that. I'm actually going to put the screen fade above the dialog box. We could actually deactivate the dialog box as well. Otherwise, it's going to show up by default, but really we're going to activate this in script when we talk to an NPC. The only thing that should always be active is this parent UI canvas. Make sure that that is checked on. Next, let's go to the assets folder, right click, create folder, and create a prefabs folder, which stands for prefabricated object, which is an object. If you want to use an object between multiple scenes, you'd make it into a prefab. So instead of going to the next scene and recreating this UI from scratch, I would turn it into a prefab that I can use in different scenes. Also helpful in scripting when you want to get a reference to a prefab or an object, or if you want to have an object get references to objects that are going to be used. Like if you had coins in your game and you had enemies that you want to drop coins, it'd be very easy to instantiate a coin prefab from a script on the enemy. But that will make more sense as we use it. Let's drag the UI from our hierarchy into our prefabs folder and turn blue, which means it's a prefab. Probably the most important note to have with prefabs is if you make any changes to a prefab, you should do it in prefab mode. If I were to make a change to this from the hierarchy, like if I made the dialog box active, that change is only being applied to this specific instance of the UI prefab. Normally, when you make changes, you want it to apply to every instance of the prefab. So the way to do that is to do it in prefab mode. So if I want to go to prefab mode, I could click on this arrow here. This is prefab mode. Now any change I make is going to apply to every single UI, or you can double click it in the prefabs folder. And this is prefab mode. So if your UI is acting funny or changes aren't, you're noticing your changes didn't go through when you press play or something, make sure that you made the changes in prefab mode, and then maybe just like replace the UI in your scene with a brand new prefab. Anyways, what's next? Okay, now we're getting into the script. So in the scripts folder, we are going to make 2 scripts. I'm just going to make them, and then maybe I'll just do a pause, and then I'll let people pause and look at what they are. But in the scripts folder, I'm actually going to create a new folder called dialog scripts. And before I go into that folder, I'm going to create C# script game manager, capital G, capital M, no space. I think that's going to compile. Main objects loader. So the game manager is going to be how we keep track of all of like the game state. Like, do we need to disable player movement? For example, when he's talking to an NPC. Main objects loader, capital M, capital O, capital L, no spaces. That's going to be how we instantiate or spawn in all of our prefabs. Instead of having a bunch of stuff in every scene, all we need is a main objects loader. It's going to load our player, our audio manager, our UI, all that kind of stuff. And it's going to load them in the right order, importantly. Another script, call it screen fade. just so we have a reference to that. Let it compile. And then 3 dialog scripts. So in the dialog folder, create a script. Dialog with a UE at the end because I spelled it weird, but unfortunately we all have to spell it that way. Capital D. That's going to be the scriptable object, so we'll talk about that in a second. Dialog manager. This is going to handle all the functionality for our dialog, so that's the big script. Basically handle how it all is going to work, like how pressing the button goes through the dialog lines and all that. The last script is dialog starter. So this is the script that's going to be on the NPC. We give it our scriptable object that has basically what the NPC is going to say. And then this is the one that activates the UI and starts the conversation. So our scripts are done. Let's save the project. Let's go to, let's deal with these general scripts first. So class assets, scripts, top-down scripts, part 3 dialog, and we'll copy this game manager, Control A, select all. If it's selecting like other stuff, be wary of that. Luckily mine is not. You have to delete that other stuff. I think I can just, it's been a while. Yeah, you can just type in game manager up there and open the script from there. Control A, select all. Control V, paste. We didn't update the player controller, but we added a variable to the player controller. So I'm going to update that script, and it's just Control A, select all, Control C, copy. Control A, select all, Control V, paste. All we added on the player controller was this can move bool. Does exactly what it sounds like it does. And then in the move character, we said if exclamation point can move. So if cannot move, that's what the exclamation point means. Then is idle is true. So if we can't move, then we're in idle position. And then down here, if we're in idle position, then our rigid body is not moving. So this is basically just how we're going to stop our player from moving. Let's go back here. Let's add the main objects loader. We know the deal. Control A, Control C. Main objects loader. If your version of Visual Studio Code doesn't have this search bar, then you can just open it from Unity by double clicking on the script. Paste the main objects loader in. And this is just getting a reference to all of these prefabs. Everything that we want in every scene. Audio, game manager, player start, UI. And it's spawning them in the awake. So when the game starts, before the game starts, it's spawning them in. We're going to see this language a lot, so I'll go over that in a second. Main objects loader is done. Let's get screen fade really quickly. Control C. Control A, Control V. We'll go ahead and file and save all. And when you save all, it's going to compile in Unity. This is a good checkpoint. Before we get to the dialogue, let's just take a break and see what that did. Actually, let's make the main objects loader. So in the hierarchy, plus create empty, and call it main objects loader. And let's add component and add our main objects loader script. If you don't see it, then you copied and pasted something wrong. You just have to go back to the script, delete the entire script, and paste over the document script. So when we added this script, we have these empty parameters. This is how it knows what to spawn. So we will put our prefabs in here. So let's make, in the hierarchy plus, create empty, name it game manager, and add the game manager script to it. And leave that as is for now. Let's go to our prefabs folder and make our main objects loader a prefab and our game manager a prefab. Let's click on our main objects loader and drag in our UI to the UI screen field and our game manager to the game manager field. but I made a mistake because I didn't do this in prefab mode. It's not actually going to apply to every version of the main objects loader. So I'm going to click this arrow. Now I'm in prefab mode. So now drag the UI in and drag the game manager in. So now those changes are going to persist. And then in the original one that's in the scene, I'm going to go to the overrides and hit apply all. So that's another way. If you make changes to one, you can go to overrides, apply all, and it'll apply those changes to all of the prefabs. So now that our main objects loader is loading the UI and the game manager or spawning them, we can delete them from the scene. Just make sure before you delete them from the scene that they are in your prefabs folder. The other thing that is going to be a prefab is our player, because our player is going to be in every scene. So I'm going to drag my player into the prefabs folder, then go into the prefabs mode of my main objects loader, and drag the player prefab into the player section. When you're filling out these parameters, make sure you're filling them out with the prefabs and not objects from your scene. So that's looking pretty good. Now I can delete my player from the scene because he's being spawned in from the prefabs from the main objects loader. So we're going to see, we already explained this actually. We explained this in the first video. But basically it's checking if it already exists. So when your main objects loader spawns in the player, if a player's there, then it's going to, you don't want two players, so it's going to delete it. We're doing that anywhere else. Anyways, let's move on to the dialogue scripts. Is that everything that we need to do? I guess one thing that we should also do before we get into dialogue is create a player start object, because that is where it's spawning the player in the main objects loader. It's finding an object called player start and putting the player in that position. So let's right click, create empty, and call it player start. Capital P, capital S, no space. And for some reason it's all the way over there, so I'm going to drag that to my scene. Press F on my grid and he can start right there, or he can start right here. You want to be able to see that, you can click on this little cube in the inspector and give it like a indicator there. All right, let's go back and start with the dialogue script. So we'll start with the dialogue scriptable object. Back in my scripts, dialogue, Control A, Control C, Control A, Control V. So this is a scriptable object. We made it into a scriptable object because it is deriving from a scriptable object versus most scripts that derive from mono behavior. And then because we have this line, create asset menu, file name, new dialogue, and all that, we can create, for example, in Unity, when we go to create, we can see, we can't see it because I didn't save it yet, but we'll see a dialogue option now. So that's how we would create dialogue for NPCs, which we'll do in a few. Let's add the dialogue manager. Save that, and then finally let's add the dialogue starter. So starting with this scriptable object, this is just holding everything that we want every dialogue to have. So we'd want them to have the portrait for the NPC, the lines that specific NPC will say, and the closing message that we'll use to tell this script to tell Unity to deactivate the dialog after this message. All right, now to talk about the dialog manager script. A lot of this is kind of getting into intermediate scripting for sure. So depending on whatever class watching this video for, maybe we're not super focused on scripting, but we're going to talk about it anyway for people who might be interested in it. At the top, these are where we're going to get references to. So all those things that we made in the UI, like the name box, the dialog box, the name text, the dialog text, we're going to attach those to these so that the script knows where to throw the portrait or throw the dialogue and stuff like that. And same idea with these, except it's going to get these from, I believe, the dialog starter. So just like what line we're on, whether or not we just started the conversation, because if we just started the conversation, then we don't want to, when we press the skip key, we don't want to start a new conversation. We just want to advance the conversation and so on. So in the update function, the method, everything in these pink parentheses under update is being called once per frame that the game is running. We're checking if, like I said, if we just started a conversation or not. So if we did not just start a conversation, then we are in the middle of a conversation, which means we're going to the next line, which is what this plus plus means. It's advancing the current line. It's going to the next index number in the array, to the next line. If the current line is greater than or equal to the maximum amount, the dialog lines dot length in the array, then it's disabling the dialog box. So this means we reach the end of the dialog lines array. The conversation's over. And then we're telling our game manager that the conversation's over, which is going to tell our game manager that it's okay for the player to move again. We're calling these two methods, which are at the bottom of the script, so we'll look at that. Dialog text equals the dialog line, the current line. So again, we're getting that from the dialog starter. It's just showing the text for the line of dialogue that we're on. Going over this method, the show dialog method, this is what we're going to call from the dialog starter script when we start a conversation. We'll show that in a second. These things in these parentheses are called arguments. So when we call, actually, let's show this right now. When we call show dialog, like when we actually, where do we call that? Like right here. We're getting a reference to our dialog manager, and we're calling show dialog, which is this. These arguments can be set here. So what do we have? Portraits, new lines, and name. So every time I said dialog starter is going to be on the NPC. Every time we call show dialog, we want to tell it which portrait to show that matches the NPC, what to say, what that NPC is saying, and what the NPC's name is. So because we want to change that every time we call this method, we make them into arguments that we can set every time we call it. Which is just going to make more sense once we see it and once we actually do it. So if new lines is not 0, so if we have new lines to show, then we're going to set the portrait to this portrait of the NPC, saying we're going to set the lines to the lines of that NPC, and we're going to start at number 0. And then we call these. And then let's keep it moving, just because I don't want this scripting section to take literally forever. But check if name. This is how, when we create the dialogue, we're going to tell it if we are, because in our dialogue we want to be able to switch between speakers. Basically what we're going to do is tell it to switch speakers by let's see, using this. And if we start a line with 2 asterisks, then it means replace the portrait of the speaker. If we start it with 2 forward slashes, then it means just advance to the next line. So when we start using the dialog scriptable object, you'll see what that means. And I'm wondering if I should just do that right now. Let's do that right now. That's enough scripting talk for now. So let's file, save all, go back to Unity, and make our first dialogue. See if I can remember how to do this, because it's been like a year. Assets, create a new folder. Oh shoot, let's create a dialogues folder. Dialogues. Right click, create dialogue. Scriptable objects look like this. So let's call this bow. I'll call it D for dialogue underscore bow introduction. That's going to be my first NPC. His name is going to be Bow. So let's, in this dialogue, in the inspector, let's set the portrait to one of those avatars that I made before in the UI of Bow. He could have a few. So there's like a bow happy, there's a bow sad. I'm not going to get into that right now, but they're in the class assets. So you can set multiple portraits for. So here. All right, and I realized I actually did this wrong, so I'm going to cut that part out and replace it with this part. But basically the forward slashes are checking the name. That's going to go in the name box, and the asterisks are checking the portrait. So first you want to set the name. So I'm going to name this guy Bow. And then you want to set the portrait to the index 0. So element 0 will go there. Then if it's just a line, you don't need a forward slash or an asterisk. Just start typing what you want the NPC to say. And when you want to switch to somebody else, you do a forward slash again, and I'll do Drew, I guess, for the protagonist name. And then if you want to switch the portrait, you would switch it from here. All right, so I made some changes. This is ultimately what my dialogue looks like right here. So you can pause if you need to do that, as long as you understand the basics. Anyways, getting into the final script, which is the dialogue starter. This is the script that we're going to put on our NPCs. It has some public variables at the top here. So whether or not we can activate a dialogue. So pretty much if a dialogue is already open, then we're going to set this to false. It's going to store the dialogue scriptable object. So everything that we just spent all that time writing, we are going to put that here on our NPC. So the bow dialogue will be on the bow NPC. Activate on awake bool. This will be true if you say just played the game and you want a dialogue to start right away. Then you would then this would be true. Otherwise, it'll activate on a button press. Sometimes we want dialogue to enter when we get close to an NPC or close to a trigger zone or something. So that's where we'd use that. So in the update function called every frame, if activate on awake is true, so if we made that true, then it's going to start this dialogue when the game starts. Oops. Provided a dialogue is not already active in the hierarchy, which is what this exclamation point means. Whenever we start a dialogue, then active in hierarchy is switched to true. We make it so that our player cannot move. And then we start the dialogue. Down here, every frame we're checking if the interact button is pressed. And if can activate is true, which is set to true when we enter the trigger zone for the NPC, which we'll set in a minute, then it'll start the dialogue. It's going to do the same stuff. So let's quickly finish going over the script, and then we'll set that interact input. Private void on trigger enter 2D. So because this is on the NPC, whenever we enter the trigger zone for the NPC, it's going to check if our tag is player. If our tag is player, then can activate equals true. And as we saw above, that's going to allow us to start the dialogue. Then when we're exiting, can activate goes back to false. So if we press the start dialogue button, nothing's going to happen. So let's set this tag on our player first. So back in Unity, go to our prefabs folder where we have our player. Open it up to prefab mode, and in the inspector in the top left here, change it from untagged to player. It's basically telling our code this is our player. Now let's go to edit, project settings, or rather edit preferences. Oh goodness, no, I was right the first time. Edit project settings and input manager, and open up this axes drop down and change it from 30 to 31, the size. That added an input at the end. Now there's like 2 debug horizontal inputs. We just added that extra debug horizontal. So let's open that one up, change the name from debug horizontal to interact, spelled exactly like that with a capital I. Then change the positive button to F, or enter, whatever you want dialogue to start. And then in the type, change the joystick axis to key or mouse button, and then we can cancel out of that. All right, let's make the first NPC. So I'm going to go to my prefabs folder, click on my player, and press Control D to duplicate it. And then I'm going to rename it NPC. And let's open that up, double click that to open it up in prefab mode. Some of these components we don't need. We don't need a rigid body. We don't need the player controller, of course. So I'm clicking on these 3 dots and I'm clicking remove components. You also don't need the animator. If you want to have an animated NPC doing an animated idle animation, then you would make a new animator controller for it and place that here. And on that animator controller, you would have the NPC idle animation. We're going to keep it simple for now and just remove it. So that leaves one circle collider. Let's leave that there. That'll be for the collision for the NPC. Let's add another component, another circle collider 2D, and make this one a little bit bigger. So it already is a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit bigger. And then check is trigger in that circle collider component. That's going to be the trigger. That's going to be the area that we can start a conversation from. For the sprite renderer, I'm going to give it a different sprite. So I went to the class assets folder and I got just a random character sprite from the class assets. Let me split it up really quickly, I guess. That's annoying. Hold on. Do all the settings we did before. Change the PPU to 16, point no filter, compression none, sprite editor slice automatic to grid by cell size, and I think it's 16 by 16. No. It is 32 by 32. Yes. And hit slice. This is the cute slime, if you want to use the exact one that I'm using. Slice, apply, and now click on my NPC. And in the sprite renderer, change the sprite to little slime. So right now, oh, I was going to make it bow, but I guess bow is going to be a slime. That's fine. Then in my prefabs, I'll drag the NPC onto the level. One more step, like I said, on the NPC, make sure you do this in prefab mode. So double click it in your prefabs folder or click on this arrow in the hierarchy and add component and add the dialog starter component. Make sure it's the starter, not the manager. And then for now, we'll activate on button press, so check that. All right, a few more things to do and then we're done. I'm gonna go open my NPC and see in the dialog starter component, there is a dialog section. Let's drag our dialog into that dialog section so that it switches from none to the name of the dialog that we made. Because I didn't make this change in prefab mode, I'm just going to click this overrides drop down and apply all. All right, so now we need to tell our dialog and name and portrait where to go. So we haven't actually added that script to anything yet. So let's do that. Let's open our UI prefab from our prefabs folder. And then I'm going to collapse all of these components. Then just on the top UI object, select that. Let's add, first of all, our screen fade component for later. And now we can change the screen fade speed to 1. We can drag in the screen fade object into both of these slots. The fade screen object and fade screen image. Drag in the screen fade from our hierarchy into those slots. Looks like that. I'm going to collapse that. And the main one is the dialog manager. Add the dialog manager to the UI object. And we have all these empty fields that we need to fill with our UI objects that we made. So I'm going to open up the dialog box while keeping the UI object selected and basically just fill it up with what it says. So like the dialog text, drag the dialog text in there. The name text section, drag the name text object in there. Same for the dialog box, name box. Portrait goes into the portrait section. Dialog starter we keep empty. That's going to be where the NPC that's talking goes. We told our script to do that. Same for the dialog portraits and lines. That's all going to be filled up via the dialog starter. So it's going to get a reference to the dialog starter, and then these are going to get a reference to that dialog starter. All this stuff. Yeah, so that is looking good for now. And this is all just when you see in our dialog manager, all these things at the top, all these public variables, dialog text, name text, dialog box, name box. That's what we're looking at here. All right, let's go ahead and test it. First, let's set the NPC, open the sprite renderer. Actually, go into prefab mode on the NPC and set the sorting layer to NPC. If you don't have an NPC sorting layer, maybe just make one, add sorting layer, and drag it so it's on top of the player. So it would be behind the player. That way our NPC is not going to spawn in front of our player. And actually, let's make this NPC name something very long. Because I want to see if the wrapping is working correctly. So in my dialog, change the name to Bo. Greenleaf, we'll do Legolas inspired from Lord of the Rings. His last name is Greenleaf, right? Something like that. So changing the name to Greenleaf the Third. Make it really long, actually. Okay, let's see if this works now. If I press play, walk up to my NPC, press the interact button, which is F. It's working. And if I press F again, he goes to the next line. And then if I press it again, it switches the name and it switches the portrait to me. And then back again to Bo. So if your names are too long and they are wrapping over the name box, then you can go to your prefabs folder, open the UI, select your name text, and set the wrapping to disabled. Or you can make the font smaller. If you press play and your dialog is showing automatically, then you just have to go into that UI and deactivate it by pressing the check mark that's next to the name. All right, so now it's not wrapping anymore, but it's still extending. But honestly, I think just make the text smaller. We don't have to get that deep into it right now. Or don't use super long names. All right, and that is a very simple dialogue system. That's a very simple NPC. It's scalable. You can have different NPCs talking. You have a portrait for every NPC. I think it's kind of awesome. If you want to make more NPCs, then you'll just have to duplicate your NPC, create another dialogue, and follow the same steps. So that's it for this lesson. Oh wait, let's see if we can move when we are talking. No, we can't. Good. So the next lesson will be creating an audio system, I think, and then a title screen and changing scenes. That's it for now. Peace.